Royal College of Art and the Royal College of Music programs in London. He's been long active in interfaith work. He served as president of the Religious Studies Conference at UC Santa Cruz, and more recently on the board of the Marin County Marin Interfaith Council. He is the co-founder and the current vice president of Bountiful Children's Foundation, a humanitarian organization that addresses children's malnutrition in the developing world. Most recently, he co-founded Fast Forward, and I'm just delighted to share with you, and I will share afterwards, the complete link to an article that appeared in the Salt Lake Tribune about Bob's notable work in really suggesting that the Latter-day Saints have a model we can share with the rest of the world in terms of fasting and raising money for good causes. In this case, they're talking about climate change and other earthly stewardship responsibilities. A wonderful article about Bob's innovation in sharing this concept with Martin Palmer, a very noted religious writer, scholar, theologian, and environmental activist in England. So that would be something that maybe we'll even have Bob talk about at some future date as well. Bob has published widely on Mormon and religious studies, as well as on politics, culture, literature, education, the arts, and LGBTQ studies, and is the author of A New Witness for the World about the Book of Mormon, which has been reviewed critically. And I cited in the introduction, or the announcement actually, this wonderful description of it. It makes us all want to read his book. Rees's collection of essays on the Book of Mormon extend over half a century of serious, meticulous scholarship that reflects the influence both of early mentors like Hugh Nibley, Truman Madsen, and Robert K. Thomas, but also a generation of contemporary scholars who approach the Book of Mormon with new critical perspectives and tools. A New Witness for the World reflects his profound appreciation for the stylistic riches and narrative complexities of the Book of Mormon prophets and other record keepers, including their central focus on Jesus Christ. Rees responds to their personal lives and utterances with both his heart and his mind, and persuades readers to do likewise. So when I talked to Bob about a topic, he said, "What would you like me to speak about?" I said, "I can't think of anything better than to hear you talk about the Book of Mormon, which you obviously love so much." He's also said that the very near and dear to his heart is the role and the responsibility to care for malnourished children. And so he's going to talk a little bit about both tonight. Welcome, Bob Rees. Delighted to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Ross. My connection to you goes back a long time and is connected to some people that we both love dearly. So it's just a great honor to have an opportunity to spend time in your very notable Zoom firesides. I would like to say a word or two about the work of the Bountiful Children's Foundation, because it is so important. 14 years ago, some friends of mine and I started this foundation. We began with one congregation in Ecuador. We're now in 200 congregations, Latter-day Saint congregations in 20 countries, from Mongolia to Madagascar, and from the Philippines to Peru. Essentially what we do is we raise money to address children's malnutrition. I see some of you on this Zoomcast who've been generous donators, and some of you who have even traveled with us to these countries to participate in these screenings. It might surprise many people to know that there are probably somewhere around 170 to 180,000 malnourished Latter-day Saint children in the developing world. And the work of the foundation is to find ways of addressing their condition. We focus on the first 1,000 days because that's the period in which the brain and the body have their greatest development. And if a child does not get proper nutrition during those first 1,000 days, the cognitive impairment lasts for a lifetime. So it's one of the most critical ways in which one can invest a modest amount to, or more than modest if you can do that. But for $100, we can provide, the foundation provides the nutritional supplements for a child for an entire year. So just imagine that for $100, you could save the life of a child and make that child have a more hopeful future, and a future in which he or she can do greater service to the church and to their community, to their family. So it's joyful work. My wife and I have loved traveling to different places and meeting these beautiful families, many of whom are extremely poor and who work hard to do what they can, and whose faith and faithfulness, I think, are a tribute to the effect that the gospel has in the lives of people. So those of us in the developed world can reach out. If you just go to bountifulchildren.org, you can read about our work, and you can find a way to make a contribution. So we're pleased that recently, in a recent meeting we've had with people from the church welfare and the presiding bishop's office, we will soon be working cooperatively with the church and the church with us to feed. We're right now, for all the work that we're doing and for the money that we raise, which is well over $1 million a year, we're still only able to feed about 10% of the children in need. So anything that any of you wish to do, we would welcome it. And it is, as I said, wonderful and joyful work. So the Book of Mormon. About 3 hours ago, my computer failed. And so I had all kinds of notes and slides and share screen up, and I had somebody here trying to help me, but it is one of the vagaries of technology that is not entirely dependable, and sometimes chooses the worst time to be independable. Anyway, I'll try to do the best that I can without that. I've been studying and writing and teaching the Book of Mormon for the past 60 years. I've taught it in institute and in seminary and gospel doctrine class for probably more years than I could count, and in the university. I have had the privilege of teaching the Book of Mormon for the past 12 years at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. My students are Muslims and Jews and Christians of all kind, and Buddhists, and it's been just one of the really joyful things to be able to teach the Book of Mormon to people who are studying for the ministry in different religions. And we've had wonderful conversations about the book. I've had wonderful papers written by Jesuit priests and by people studying to be Jewish rabbis and others, and just been a terrific experience to be able to do that. The book that I've written, A New Witness to the World, comes out of the more than half a century of serious study I've done of the Book of Mormon. And in reading the Book of Mormon, in reading all of as much of the scholarship as I can, which is very voluminous. Right now, there's a tremendous amount of scholarship being done. This has been, over the past 30 or 40 years, a whole new area of study of the Book of Mormon that has been, to me, a wonderful thing. And in my book, I have a chapter called Carrying Water on Both Shoulders. It comes from an essay that Lowell Benyon, one of the great scholars of the 20th century, wrote. And in his essay called Carrying Water on Both Shoulders, Lowell talks about the importance of approaching the gospel with both our head and our heart, that God has given us both, and that if we use both of them, we are much more likely to be serious readers and deep readers of the Book of Mormon. And so, in the work that I've done, I've tried to balance my study of the Book of Mormon both with serious scholarly and cognitive skills, but also paying attention to what we might call the the spiritual and revelatory and imaginative truths of the Book of Mormon. It's interesting to look at the range of scholarship being done on the Book of Mormon by Latter-day Saints and by non-Latter-day Saints. Recently, some of the most serious study of the Book of Mormon has been done by non-Latter-day Saint scholars. Out of this great body of scholarship, there has been, it seems to me, a great deal of enlightenment, a great deal of serious conversation, a great deal of serious questions. I sometimes ask my gospel doctrine class, what does the Jewish mother say to her student, her daughter, when she comes home from Hebrew school? And everybody says, she says, what did you learn? I said, no. She says, did you ask good questions? So asking good questions about the Book of Mormon is one of the ways to begin to understand it. One of the biggest questions that continues to engage scholars is what is called the provenance of the Book of Mormon. Where did the Book of Mormon come from, and who wrote it? There has been, from even before it was published, there was controversy about who was the author. That controversy has continued with scholars being divided essentially into two schools: those who believe that it had an ancient origin, and those who believe that it originated in the 19th century. People who believe that Joseph Smith or one of his contemporaries or a number of people wrote the Book of Mormon, and others who feel this is a book that has its ancient origins, was written by ancient people, translated in the 19th century. Part of my approach to the Book of Mormon is essentially to focus much more on the text itself and what it says, because I have come to believe that the text is the most revelatory thing that we have. That is, we don't have the archaeological evidence that would help us place the Book of Mormon squarely in the ancient world. We don't have testimonies of people who saw the original plates before they were handed to Joseph Smith. We do have the text itself. And I was thinking about, as a literary scholar, I like to think of analogies of helping us to understand something. So I'm going to share a couple of analogies that I've made about the Book of Mormon, because I do consider it an authentic ancient text. I do consider Alma and Nephi and Moroni as real figures who lived in the past and who wrote a history of their peoples. But to say, is it a product of the 19th century? In my book, I say, I've tried to think of an analogy which fits the idea of Joseph Smith writing the Book of Mormon. To me, it would be as if a frontier craftsman who was a maker of rugs were suddenly to produce an oriental carpet that required a knowledge of ancient traditions of weaving, dyeing, and fabric, and then were to weave a carpet of such complexity that only in the 20th century was someone able to discern and decipher its intricate figures and patterns. That is, I think the Book of Mormon is analogous to the weaving of a very elaborate and highly sophisticated carpet. Or it would be like a frontiersman who could pluck out a few bars of Yankee Doodle Dandy on a banjo, being able to compose and dictate an elaborate fugue or a symphony for full chorus and orchestra. But Hugh Nibley, who was one of my teachers, provides at least the funniest analogy. He said it would be, to put it facetiously but not unfairly, the artists who were to create the Book of Mormon, who set out for such a work as the Book of Mormon, must not only balance a bowl of goldfish and 3 lighted candles on the end of a broomstick while fighting off a swarm of gadflies, but he must at the same time be carving an immortal piece of statuary from a lump of solid dorite. Well, that was typical of Nibley's humor, but it is also, it seems to me, a serious, at least my conclusion after studying the Book of Mormon for so long is that I cannot situate it in the 19th century America. It is so complex, so intricate, so sophisticated that it seems to me beyond not simply Joseph Smith, but in one of my chapters in which I compare the Book of Mormon to writers that I have taught for many, many years, the writers of the American Renaissance, Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Whitman, and Hawthorne, I conclude that if you were to put all of those writers in the Library of Congress in 1820, you had given them 10 years and they had access to every book that was available in America, that all of them together could not have produced the Book of Mormon. That's my informed opinion. I know people who will disagree with that, but that comes from having considered all of the points of view, all of the arguments for and against the Book of Mormon as an authentic ancient text. So part of what do we have? We have a text that reveals itself. And part of the problem, I think, with many people is that they read the text superficially. And I know what that's like, because when I was starting out, that's how I read it. The Book of Mormon invites us to ask ourselves, what is the context in which this book was written? And I think the example of First Nephi, I was going to have Ross put a text upon the screen. I don't think that we were successful in sharing it, but if you just spent, now here we're going to try. Let's see what happens with this modern technology. Okay, so we have this, the first page of the Book of Nephi had just disappeared, so maybe that's all we're going to get, was that quick look at it. But one of the questions the text asks us to think about, and when I teach my literature courses, I tell my students, focus on the beginning and the ending and what happens in between. The first words of the Book of Mormon are, I, Nephi. And that's important because Nephi, we have to think about who's writing this, when is he writing it, what's the context. Nephi is writing this 30 years after they left the ancient world, after he was helpful getting the text. You can see in this screen, and if you can see the second one, it would be identifying all of the words in which Nephi uses the personal pronoun. He uses I, me, and mine continually in this first, especially in the first chapter. I think I figured out that he had in these two, it's not Lehi's dream, but it's back to the other one that we can look at. But what he does is identify, if you look at the words that are repeated, the words that are important in the first chapter, Nephi is saying, this is who I am. I've written this book by myself. I've created the metal but by my own hands. He tells his story. And why is he doing that? Why is he identifying himself as the author? And why does he say the most important repeated words are his personal pronouns, and then he starts talking about his father. Nephi is identifying himself with his father in this first chapter. I think you're not showing the screen, so perhaps we can just dispense with that at this point because it's difficult to see that. But what you see are the repeated words, and Nephi is trying very hard in this opening chapter. Keep in mind that he has been leaves, it comes out and disappears. So maybe we can just do without it. What is really important and what Nephi is telling us is that, because he repeats, my father, my father, my father, I, Nephi, my father Lehi. He continues to say this, and then he talks about him and the Lord and Father Lehi and the Lord. He's doing that because he's trying, this is 30 years later, after they've left Jerusalem. He has suffered persecution at the hands of his brothers. Keep in mind that Nephi is a middle child, and his older brothers, who think they have the right to be running things, are really angry with him. They try to kill him. They persecute him, as you know from reading that. Nephi is continuing. If we read the first Nephi, just pay attention to all of the times he used personal pronoun. He uses personal pronoun for his father 48 times in this first chapter, because he's trying to establish himself as the inheritor of the prophetic mantle. That is what he's doing. And if you're paying attention to repeating words, and this is what you see, and you read the first chapter of Genesis. The Book of Mormon is very much like the Old Testament. The first chapter, if you read the first chapter of Genesis, you read almost every chapter or every verse begins, and God did something, and it ends, and it was good. The Hebrew prophets would have been happy if the only thing you got out of the first chapter of the Old Testament was that God did something, it was good. So they use repetition in a beautiful way. And the Book of Mormon uses repetition constantly to emphasize certain things. So as you read this, pay attention to words that are repeated. Another Hebrew technique is irony. The biblical scholars were great writers of irony. Irony is when you have something which seems true on one level, but is then true in a different way on another level. So there is either sarcasm or there is a different level of meaning. And so you have this throughout the Book of Mormon, beautiful examples of irony. One of these is seen in Nephi, when Nephi goes up to Jerusalem and he tries to get the plates and he can't get them. He goes out at night and he finds Laban, and he sees Laban. What's the first thing Nephi does? He, like any kid in 600 BC, any Jewish or Hebrew person, any Israelite, he is so fascinated by the sword. He picks up the sword and he starts talking about the sword. He gives all of these descriptions of it. It's the kind of thing that the 19th century teenager would have seen if he had found a dead cowboy with a 6-shooter. He would have picked it up and just said, "Oh, this is the neatest thing I've ever seen," which is what so you see Nephi as being a typical teenager. Maybe he was 16, 18, we don't know, but he's pretty young. And he says very early in his story, I, Nephi, being large of stature but exceeding young. He says that to us. After he slays Laban, shortly thereafter he says, I, Nephi, being a man. Very short time. Why? Because that is the most difficult thing Nephi will ever do. So if you pay attention to what Nephi says, if you pay attention to the use of the situation in which he finds himself, you will find revelation after revelation of what Nephi is telling us, sometimes inadvertently. He tells us things about himself that he doesn't intend to tell, but he also tells things that are important for our understanding of the text. Another good example of irony is seen with Abinadi. I'm having to just pick and choose some things. In the Old Testament, what the Old Testament writers wanted to show you is an ordinary person who becomes extraordinary when God puts his finger on it, or her. We don't have many hers, but there are examples of that in the Old Testament. And so what you have is, in the beginning, you see Abraham, who lies to the Lord. When the Lord sends these messengers, Abraham lies. He doesn't tell the truth. Later, Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son. And so what happens to Abraham before and after God puts his finger on him is an example that the writers of Scripture want you to see yourself in these Scriptures. They want you to see that God takes ordinary people. They don't start out heroic. They don't start out as prophets. They start out as ordinary people. And so they give you a lot of examples of that. And a great example of this in the Book of Mormon is Abinadi. Abinadi is a reluctant prophet. It's very, very funny. The Lord calls him to go and preach to the people, and he stands up and says, "Thus hath the Lord saying, go and preach to this people, and this, the Lord said this, and the Lord said that, and he's called me to do this, but this is," he's basically saying, this is his idea, not mine. King Noah is really angry with him, sends his priests out to kill him. Abinadi runs away from his priests, and he's gone for 2 years. You see, he's not anxious to get back to preach the gospel to the king. And I sometimes think, how would I feel if God called me to go to San Francisco and preach the gospel? I probably would take the long way. Well, Abinadi takes the long way, and he's gone for 2 years. It doesn't take 2 years to grow a beard and to come among them in disguise, but he's gone for 2 years. He comes back, and it says he came among them in disguise that they knew him not. And he doesn't get a whole sentence out before he tells him who he is. The Lord commanded me, saying to his people, Abinadi. Oops. Abinadi has 2 years of disguise, and he can't say one sentence without revealing who he is. And they take him again, capture him, take him before the king. And Noah wants to put him to death, but he wants to have cause for doing that. So he sends his priest to question Abinadi. Abinadi is not a biblical scholar. Abinadi is not someone who spent a lot of time in the what would be called the study place, studying the Scriptures. So the priest asks him a question that I think he can't answer, but he very cleverly says, "You're priest. You're asking me. You should know this. You tell me the answer." The priests then come back with a very difficult passage from Isaiah and asks him, and Abinadi again says, he calls them to repentance. You should be. They ask him about the Ten Commandments, to recite the Ten Commandments. Abinadi only knows 2 of the Ten Commandments. How do we know that? Because he quotes the first 2, and then he says, "Have you done all of this?" And then later he gets a copy of them, and he says, "I read to you the remainder of the Ten Commandments." So he has to get a text in order to know them. Probably not everybody on this Zoomcast can quote all of the Ten Commandments. We probably know some of them, but there are a lot of things. If we had to, we probably wouldn't be able to do it. And Abinadi doesn't either. But Abinadi accepts his calling, and he accepts his fate, and he is put to death by fire by the king. But before he does, he stands up and gives this incredible, powerful sermon, and we see him change from an ordinary person. It says his face was luminous. He was likened to Moses. So that here, a person who starts out being like anybody, like your ministering teacher, or maybe your bishop or stake president or your Relief Society president, becomes this great person because he allows the Lord to touch his life and to change him into a powerful person. One of the things that we see when we're asking the question about the Book of Mormon, and when I talk about the fact I've tried to situate the Book of Mormon within the 19th century, and when people say Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, in my classes, I compare Joseph Smith to his contemporaries. Joseph Smith was contemporary, as I mentioned before, with Emerson, with Thoreau, with Melville, with Whitman, with the great writers. And if you look at them and you look at their great, they all published what was called their magnum opus, or their great book. So you have Walden, you have Moby Dick, you have The Scarlet Letter, you have Leaves of Grass. Those are all published within 5 years at mid-century. The important thing is that you go back and look at the history of each of those writers in each of those books. They had a long history. Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne are trying out. They take years to develop their style. And you can see their style maturing from an immature to mature style. It's what Melville calls the tri-works in Moby Dick. These are the things a writer does to polish his writing. What's really interesting is the Book of Mormon is published in 1830. Joseph Smith has a second grade education. He is a self-educated person. He continues to educate himself. But when you compare him with Emerson and Hawthorne, or Emerson and Thoreau, who went to Harvard, with Hawthorne, who went to Bowdoin College, with other writers who had a great formal education and then had years in which to polish their style. When Joseph Smith has published the Book of Mormon, the only thing we have of his writing are a couple of sentences, a couple of paragraphs possibly. Joseph Smith has produced, there's no evidence that Joseph Smith was trying to find a way to write something as complex and as sophisticated as the Book of Mormon. So what you have is examples throughout the Book of Mormon of highly sophisticated writing that is a clearly erudite, learned person who's writing what we have. This is not something that someone could just sit down and knock off like they wanted to perpetuate some kind of a fraud or some kind of a ruse, as people claim Joseph Smith as having done. I want to be respectful of time. Ross, how much time do we have in this seminar?
We've got plenty of time, Bob. Don't worry about that. 7:38. We've got at least 8 o'clock, or we can keep going.
Okay, so let me tell you about one of the elements of the Book of Mormon. You know, if Joseph Smith was setting out to create a fraud, one has to ask what his motive would be in writing the Book of Mormon. Why would he write a book that's so complex, that has so many different authorial voices? You know, you look at the different narrators or different writers in the Book of Mormon. Look at Alma. And one of the things about Abinadi you look at Abinadi and you say, well, Abinadi didn't do much. He preached to these people. They put him to death. Abinadi converted one person. And that person, Alma, changed the course of Book of Mormon history. So it's a good example for people, missionaries, who may not feel that they're very successful. When I was a young missionary at 19, my first city was Kankakee, Illinois, a little small town outside Chicago. My missionary companions and I converted a couple of brothers who were married to a couple of sisters, and my wife and I went to visit one of them a couple of years ago, and from that couple and their children and their grandchildren, I think there have been something like 40 missions that have been served in the church, and countless number of people. Well, this is what you have in the Book of Mormon with someone like Abinadi, who converts one person who changes the course of history. It's a great story. But one of the things one's asking, that I ask about Joseph Smith, why is he writing this book? If he's doing it to make money or he's perpetuating a fraud, his main purpose in the Book of Mormon's a central idea is to convert people to Christ. Why would somebody do that if they were trying to do something to commit a fraud? But what you have in this book are these powerful stories. The most powerful one is what takes place in 3rd Nephi. I gave a lecture at BYU in March that was called Imagining Peace. And it was about the 3rd and 4th Nephi. 3rd and 4th Nephi can be seen as kind of like a classical tragedy, almost a Greek or a Shakespearean tragedy. And what the Book of Mormon is calling us to do is to imagine what's happening in 3rd Nephi. And I'd like you to do that just for a second. Imagine that you are living and you're, let's say, a 7 or 8 year old child, and the world totally falls apart. There's great earthquakes, and there's cyclones, and there's hurricanes, and the destruction is so great that you can't see anything, or you can't hear anything except people screaming and wailing and lamenting. You're in total blackness. It says that there was no sun, no moon, no stars, that there was no fire. You couldn't light a fire. So imagine that you're a 7-year-old child, and you're all that you've known has disappeared. All you see is total blackness. That's what we see in those first those chapters in the Book of Mormon. And you don't know whether you will ever see anything again because there's no light. And then you hear a voice coming out of the sky, and you don't understand it. You can't hear what it's saying. And then you hear it again. And a little bit later, in this blackness, in this darkness, you see a figure, a light descending out of heaven. Imagine, the Book of Mormon is calling you to imagine what you would feel like if you were that 7-year-old girl, to see that drama of great blackness and tragedy and destruction. And then you see this figure, and this figure comes down and identifies himself as Jesus Christ. And he calls you as a 7-year-old girl to come to him. He calls all the children. They're not very many because we know he blesses all of them. But those who have survived, the children and the adults, he calls the adults, he calls the adults to bring the children. And you're one of the ones that they tell to come. And he then asks you to come and sit in front of him. And then he puts his hands on your head and blesses you. And you look up and see angels coming out of heaven like fire, surrounded by fire. And they too bless you. And what happens to you as a 7-year-old child totally transforms your life. You remember for the rest of your life what it was like to be in total blackness, what it was like not to find your mother or your father or your brothers or sisters or anyone, and to be in that darkness and not know whether you could even find your way to any food or to any shelter. You don't know that. You're frightened. And then this figure of light comes and blesses you and tells you and calls you with the other children, the other people, to be peacemakers, and teaches you his gospel and tells you to remember what happened. One definition of remember is to pass through the heart again. And Jesus is asking you to hold what has just happened in your heart. And imagine what your life is going to be like from then on. Those people created 200 years of peace based on what happened on that very short time when Jesus came out of the darkness and gave them light. So imagine your life now. Let's say it's 70 or 80 years later, and you have lived your life from coming out of that darkness into that light. And your grandchildren come and say, Grandma, tell us that story again. And you go back and tell what it was like to come out of darkness into light. And you bless them. They will hold that light in their hearts, which they do until 200 years later. They forget that story and begin again to turn to the darkness, so that Mormon gives this great condemnation. He says that his people were without civilization. What a horrible, horrible way to live without civilization. And then you come down to the end of the Book of Mormon, which is just this great tragedy. This people who came out of Jerusalem, the people who've been led by prophets, the people who've had these revelations, the people who had Jesus come to them personally and teach them and teach their children. These people forget all of that and turned to darkness. And that great civilization ends, and Moroni, his last lament is about this, and his last call is for people to turn into Christ and to come unto him and to give their hearts to him. The Book of Mormon is 1,000 years of human tragedy and human triumph, but that tragedy that comes at the end was written for our day. And so the purpose of the Book of Mormon is written for us, is to teach us what God wants us to know. And what he wants us to know most of anything is that it's his Son who came to save us from darkness, to rescue us from our sins, to teach us how to choose the light over the darkness. If you read the Book of Mormon that way, read it, look at the images of light and darkness that play throughout the Book of Mormon. It is a contest between the powers of light and the powers of darkness. It is a contest between people who turn their lives over to Christ and those who turn against that light and turn against Christ and against their neighbors, who become savages, who become who are cannibalistic, who do the most horrible things that is to imagine. But always there is the call back to light. In the beginning of my book on the Book of Mormon, I say this, and allow me just to read a couple of paragraphs. I love the Book of Mormon, most of all because it has led me to a greater, deeper, and more expansive understanding of the life and mission of Jesus Christ, opening my heart wider to experience his love. The Book of Mormon testifies of Christ from the very beginning, declaring its intention to convince Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God manifesting himself to all nations. That intention is evident in the very first chapter, where the prophet Lehi has a vision of one descending out of the midst of the heaven, whose luster was above that of the noonday. That is what we see in later revealed in Nephi. To the very last chapter, where Moroni says, "If ye by the grace of God are perfect in Christ and deny not his power, then are ye sanctified in Christ by the grace of God through the shedding of the blood of Christ, which is in the covenant of the Father, into the remission of your sins, that ye become holy without spot." Through the many testimonies of the Book of Mormon prophets, and through Christ's own testimony to the Nephites, and through them to future generations, including those of us living today, I have come to exclaim, as does Nephi, "I glory in plainness, I glory in truth. I glory in my Jesus. That's beautiful. Nephi giving that personal. I glory in my Jesus, for he has redeemed my soul from hell. I love the Book of Mormon because of that great witness of who Jesus Christ is. I'd like to save some time, we reserve some time for some questions, but I also want to just reiterate my closing chapter in my book is that the figure of love, the ultimate message of the Book of Mormon. And I say that the ultimate message of the Book of Mormon is love. It is ultimately the message that's given throughout it. And I conclude by saying, if we don't find love on the pages of the Book of Mormon, we have not read it deeply or carefully enough. It is because the Book of Mormon is about love, because it's about the love of God, it's about the love of Christ, it's about calling us to love one another, including the least of these that Jesus teaches us, that it is a book that is read by more people than by any other book written in the 19th century, and will continue because there's a witness of Christ to bless those who give their hearts and their minds and their souls to it seriously. It is a serious book. It has serious messages. It rewards serious reading and thinking and witnessing. And I pray the Lord will bless us as we give ourselves to it, heart and soul, to listen and to open our eyes and our hearts to His message. Okay, it's not an awful lot of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have. And Ross, if there are questions in the chat, I'm happy to answer those as well.
Bob, let me start out with a question here for you. Your love for the Book of Mormon is so wonderful, so delightful. What a powerful description you've given of the Book of Mormon. I don't know how anybody who hasn't read the Book of Mormon would run right away to start to read the Book of Mormon and find the joy that you find in it. How did that come about, that you are such a lover of the Book of Mormon? Was that something that you were born with? Was it something that you developed over the years? Is your view of the Book of Mormon the same now as it was when you were a 19-year-old missionary? Tell us a little bit about that.
I was blessed, as I think most people are, to have a couple of teachers who changed my life. One of them, I didn't know. Nobody in my family had graduated from college. My parents hadn't even graduated from high school. I didn't think I was very smart. I still don't think I am. But I had a teacher who taught. I took a course that he taught called Introduction to Literature, and he was such a great teacher. I took every course he taught. I majored in teachers more than I did in classes. His name was Robert K. Thomas, and he took his course on the Bible as literature, and I just fell in love with the Bible. And Bob had done his undergraduate work at Reed College in Portland, and he wrote an undergraduate paper called the Literary Book of Mormon. And he started talking to me started teaching me, and I took the Book of Mormon from him, and it just opened the Book of Mormon in ways that have continued to be open to me. And that changed my life. I didn't know what I wanted to be, but when I took a course from Bob Thomas, I said, I want to be like him. And so I went on to get a master's and a PhD in literature. I started studying texts, including Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton, and those texts just opened up to me worlds that I didn't know existed. So I kept studying the Book of Mormon over the years, and each time I went back to it, it revealed something new. I just reading it in preparation for this class or this webinar tonight, I saw some stuff I hadn't seen before. And that happens every time I read it. And that happens every time I read Shakespeare or every time I read Walden. A text that's this rich will always reveal more to us because we come back to it changed. And we come back to it with more knowledge. We come back to it with more understanding. And we see things that we never saw before. And so I love the Book of Mormon because it continually reveals really exciting things. I mean, it's delightful to me and when I read something, when I read a book by Grant Hardy or Adam Miller or so many of the other great scholars of the Book of Mormon, I'm just delighted. They show me things that I didn't see. I have the privilege with Adam Miller and Joseph Spencer of being in the Book of Mormon seminar. You spend 2 weeks, 8 hours a day looking at 2 chapters of the Book of Mormon. And I wrote one of the chapters in my book is on the heart in Alma 12 and 13. And I didn't know that the heart figured so prominently in the Book of Mormon. The word heart appears 1,000 times in the Bible. It appears, I think, 700 times in the Book of Mormon. And the way that it appears, and in these particular, it appears more frequently in those 2 chapters of Alma than any place else in the Book of Mormon. Why? Well, because Alma is talking about people being hard-hearted. And so the difference between soft-hearted and hard-hearted is really important in the Book of Mormon. It unfolds so much meaning. But I had never seen that until I spent a couple of weeks looking at those 2 chapters. So I'm just inviting you. Reading the Book of Mormon is an adventure. And reading it carefully and closely and often is an adventure that always pays dividends. So that teacher changed my life, and I've just had the privilege of teaching that to my students. Let me tell you a very quick story. I had a Jesuit Father Butterworth, who came and took both of the courses I taught on Mormonism at Graduate Theological Union, and he wrote a beautiful paper on King Benjamin, one of the best papers I've ever read. And he said when he left the class, he said, "When I graduate in a couple of years and I become ordained, will you come to the ordination ceremony?" I said, "I would be honored to." So I kind of forgot about that. And a couple years later, I got this invitation to this large Catholic church in North Hollywood. So I went down, and there were 40 Jesuit priests there witnessing the ordination of this priest who had been such a good student of mine and such a good student of the Book of Mormon. And so I saw him ordained. And then since I feel very comfortable taking the Eucharist or the sacrament in other churches because I find fellow believers, they're doing the same thing we do in sacrament, which is symbolizing their covenant with Christ. And so I was just kind of meditating, and I went up to partake of the Eucharist, and there was my student handing me the wafer, which I felt really honored to take from him. And then after the ceremony was over and people were dispersing, I was looking for him, and I went up to find him, and I said, he was there with his mother, and I said to his mother, "Your son is not only one of the best students I've ever had, he's one of the best people that I've ever had the privilege of meeting." And he turned to me and said, "Would you like a blessing?" And I said, "I would be honored to have a blessing." And this, my former student, now a Catholic priest, laid his hands on my head and gave me the first blessing that he gave. And it was a beautiful blessing. And it was beautiful to be blessed by one of my students that I had the opportunity to bless by teaching him the Book of Mormon. Okay.
Wonderful.
That's a long story.
My friend Larry Peterson asks, can you tell us more about your multi-faith class members' reaction to the Book of Mormon? You told us a little bit about that, but tell us more.
Well, it's so interesting. I have them read the Book of Mormon. I have them attend a church service, Latter-day Saints. I have them watch a session of conference. I invite a stake president and a bishop in to tell them what it's like to run, and a Relief Society president, a Young Women's president, primary president, to tell them what it's like to run a ward. I invite. I spend one evening this semester having a bunch of returned missionaries come in and talk about their experience. I've taught these courses at the Institute of Religion in Berkeley, so Institute students come to my classes and mingle with the graduate students, and the students love having that opportunity. But the students take it seriously, as if they're Jews, they're taking courses reading the Quran, reading the New Testament, they're reading the Eastern texts. They're trying to understand the scriptures of other believers, and I find when I read the Quran and when I read the Veda, when I read the Eastern texts, they enlighten me. So I'm happy to read other texts, because I invite my students to read the Book of Mormon and the Pearl of Great Price and sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. They're there to learn about Mormonism. I'd like them to really have a chance to read our texts.
Great. Actually, let me turn next to the question raised by my good friend John Kidd, who says, tell us a little bit more about Fast Forward for the Future of the Planet and the special insights the faith provides to address this existential problem.
Thank you for the question. I've been seriously studying climate change and environmental issues for the past dozen years, and even designed a course at UC Berkeley called Religion and the Fate of the Earth, because I feel that religions have the gift of understanding that all the religions feel that we are stewards of the earth. And stewards doesn't mean lords over it, it means caretakers of it. And so Gloria, my dear wife, who's watching this podcast, she and I were thinking, what could we do in our remaining years to try and do something to make the earth a safer, more beautiful, more habitable place for our children and grandchildren and those who are come after. And as we thought about that, the thought occurred to us, one of the most successful things the church does is have us fast one day a month and to pay fast offering. The church brings in somewhere around $120 million a year in fast offerings, which is really amazing. As a bishop, I loved being able to access fast offerings to bless people who were poor. So Gloria and I thought about this, and it occurred to us, if we could convince our fellow believers to dedicate one Sunday or Friday or Saturday, one day of the month, to fasting for the planet, it could generate, if only 1%, 80% of the people of the earth claim adherence to a religion. That's amazing. That 80% of the people claim adherence to a religion. If only 1% of those people were to fast one day a month and pay $1, it would generate in a year $1 billion that could go to address droughts and fires and rising seas and clean air. It could help clean up the Great Salt Lake. It could do so much good. And so we decided to create a program called Fast Forward for the Future of the Planet, to invite all the religions to do this. And we were fortunate to get this Englishman, Martin Palmer, who for 30 years worked very closely with Prince Philip, who died just earlier this year. And Prince Philip and Martin worked 30 years to get the faiths united in addressing climate issues. And so we came up with this idea, and we went to Salt Lake last month to present it, and it was so warmly and enthusiastically received. Latter-day Saints, even their group of Latter-day Saints called the Mormons of Environmental Stewardship, association, I think it's called MESA, another called Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship, and they've already adopted the third Sunday of the month, which is coming up, the third Sunday of the month, to fast and to pay a fast offering. And what was delighted us is the Episcopalians and the Muslims and other people who heard about this said, this is such a great idea, because Muslims fast and Jews fast and Christians fast. They all do this. They don't have to be convinced that fasting is a good thing to do. And it makes you healthier and happier. And once you get over the cranky first meal, for me, but fasting is such a powerful thing to do. I didn't know until I started studying this, that in 1985, when somebody in the church said, there's a famine in Ethiopia, we want the church members to fast. In January and November, there were 2 fasts held by the church for the people in Ethiopia. That raised $11 million. And a couple of apostles went to Ethiopia, and they looked at the condition of the people, and there is where church LDS Charities began, with that fasting program for Ethiopia. And out of that has grown this great humanitarian. The church gave something like $96 million in humanitarian work, humanitarian funds last year. This is a great idea, and everybody can do it, or almost everybody. There are very few people who, for health reasons, can't do it, but everyone can do it, and it's a small sacrifice. But by making a small sacrifice, if 1 million people, Gloria and I use Mother Teresa's epigraph as ours. Mother Teresa said, we can do no great things, only small things with great love. Fasting 1 day a month is a small thing that we can do with great love. And if we do what we do on Fast Sunday, pay that for, and we're working now to get an international fund where people can pay their fast offerings. But in the meantime, this is taken off so fast. We were unprepared for all of the fantastic response to it. But already some organizations are joining this program. So we haven't even got a website up yet. That's how unprepared we were for the enthusiasm. But just imagine that what you could do with $1 billion, and what you could do if 10 times that people did. If you could get as many people, the fast offerings for the church are probably generated by about 4 million people. I think it's estimated that maybe a quarter of the 16 million people who are Latter-day Saints fast. But just think of the power that unleashes. And in addition, Fast Forward says, as you're fasting from food, also fast from other things you're doing. If you're using too much water, think about that during that fast day. Think about how you can conserve energy. And so like with Lent, people give up habits during Lent that are counter to what they do. So what I think our partner calls it faith-consistent fasting. Fast for the things that we believe in. So you heard it here first. I'm sure you'll hear about it again. It's a great idea that, I say it's a great idea. It was just something we came up with thinking, gee, we think this is it's such a successful program in the church. It's one of the most successful programs the church has ever had. And if we could convince other people, all they have to do is do what they do to fast, but paying a fast offering is something that is so powerful for the church that we're very excited about it. So thank you for asking that question.
Great. My friend Gil Gould tells us about his experience. It's available for everybody to read in the chat of discovering the Book of Mormon somewhat late in life. And he asks the question, he says, have you been successful in helping people without a great need, that is, not called as missionaries right now and have to bear their testimony about the Book of Mormon, but individuals who need to read the Book of Mormon with the same desire that they do when they have such immediate needs? In other words, what's the effect of your teaching others to love the Book of Mormon as you do?
Basically, I just tell them to trust it. Let it open itself to you as you open yourself to it. That is, people. You can. People can read the Book of Mormon and think, as Mark Twain did, that it's chloroform in print. It's so boring. Or you can read it, and if you give yourself to it, when I read a novel or read a poem, I like to just open my heart and mind and say, what does this have to say to me? And so carefully read and reread. Read, don't just read through it. Look, here's a little assignment. There are two versions of Lehi's dream in the book of Nephi. Lehi's, which is told by his son, and Nephi is so enthralled with Lehi's dream, he wants to have a dream too. And so he asks God for a dream, and he has a dream. Compare Lehi's dream as told by Nephi and Nephi's dream. And look at the difference between them. They're both great stories. They're both wonderful accounts of this great dream. And then see how differently Nephi, and look what happens in Lehi's dream. What happens? The story, the dream isn't just told to Nephi. The angel quizzes him about it. What do you see? What does it mean? And this is what the Book of Mormon is asking us. The Book of Mormon, almost in every page, is saying, "What do you see? What do what's here? What are the images that are used in the Book of Mormon? What are the stories? Who is telling the story? Look at those stories told by in those short books, of which Enos is one. Why is Enos' story told differently? Why does it stand out? There's this beautiful thing in Enos' story. Enos he's not a reader of the text. He probably hasn't even read it, but it's turned over to him, and he's supposed to be the keeper of the text. And so he starts reading. He says, I haven't paid much attention to this. He's a man of the sword. And he starts reading the Book of Mormon, the text that he's reading, the scriptures given to him. And he goes out, and it causes him to pray. And he doesn't just say a prayer. He prays all day and all night. And something happens to Enos that totally surprises him. He feels his sins literally lifted from his soul. He no longer has a heavy burden. He's been a man of the sword. He's out doing destructive things. He's a man of violence. And something happens to him to completely transform him. And he asks this question, the most beautiful question in the Book of Mormon. Lord, how is it done? How did this happen? How could you lift these sins from my soul? He's astonished. Lord, how is it done? Well, that's the story. That's the question we can ask. How is this story reveal itself? How does this book continue to enlighten us? Why does it keep telling these stories that help me to understand myself and my relation to Jesus, my relation to other people? That is what it continues to ask us to do. It asks us to come into Christ and to be perfected in Him, and to have Him change our life. If we open our hearts and open the book, and our hearts and our book have a conversation, and our minds do too. I mean, our minds think about these words, and our minds ask questions. Why is it this way rather than some other way? Why does Nephi tell his story the way he does? He tells it because he's seen all of this tragedy, and he's trying to convince people that he is a prophet. And his brothers are still trying to kill him, and his brothers' children have turned against him, and some of his own children will turn against him. And he's this sad character. Look at Moroni. Moroni is the saddest character in the Book of Mormon. He's alone for 20 years. He's got nobody to talk to. Imagine. if your civilization was destroyed and everybody was trying to kill you, and you had to find your way in the world alone, and you had charge of these books, these records, and you're called upon to give this last witness, you don't know if you're going to survive even you do the witness. What is it that motivates these people? What is that motivates the anti-Nephi Lehis to bury their swords and to go out and to give their lives? It's the burning witness of who Jesus Christ is. Christ changes their lives so much so that they're willing to give up their lives for him. And so that is what the Book of Mormon asks us to do. That's what is revealed here. And it's written for our day. And all of those wars and that destruction, look around what's happening in our day. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. Look at what's happening in our own country. Look at the divisiveness. Look at the people who are at war with one another over small things. Christ's kingdom is a kingdom of peace. He doesn't call us to be peace lovers. He calls us to be peacemakers. And that great story in Nephi, where he comes personally. And I love thinking of that little girl who's in darkness and comes out of light. And I like thinking of her as a grandmother. Because as a grandfather, I want my grandchildren to know this story. I want the people to whom I minister. I want my students. I want people to know this story. It is a great story. This is the greatest story ever told of who this Son of God is and what he means to the world.
Bob, thank you so much for just such a delightful evening. My gosh, I'm glad that technology failed us tonight, because we got a chance to see and hear you directly, and we weren't distracted in the slightest by any technological glitches.
Well, it's my honor. I appreciate so much spending this hour with you, and I'm just so grateful, Ross, for this continuing dialogue. You probably are going to enter the Guinness Book of World Records for the person who's given the most Zoom and fireside. So bless you for this good work, and bless all of you who participate in these kinds of activities and events.
Well, thank you so much. Well, as I say, one of my jobs, I think, is to sell books, and I want you to know that I'm going to run out on Amazon here very quickly and sign up to get your book, A New Witness to the World, which I haven't read yet, but I promise you I will do that.
And I commit, Ross, that I'm in the poorhouse from writing books, but any proceeds from selling of my book will go to support Fast Forward for the Future, because I want us to be able to give back to God the beauty of the garden that he gave our first parents. If we can reclaim this great garden world and its creatures and give it back as a gift, then I'm happy to give anything I can to that cause.
No, bless your heart for that. Let me just give you all a teaser for next week. Saturday, August the 20th at 7:00 p.m., we're going to hear from Christine Hansen. Christine Hansen is a retired professor of English from BYU, where she taught for over 30 years. She earned a PhD in rhetoric and composition from the University of Texas. And at BYU, she taught courses in writing in the social sciences, professional writing, writing with style, the role of rhetoric in the history of civilization, the rhetoric of the American women's suffrage movement, and research methods in rhetoric and composition. Over half her career was dedicated to administration. I learned about her recently. Well, I should add also that she now lives in Spring City, Utah, which is most of our, if we had to name a favorite city in Utah, it might very well be Spring City. What a delightful place that is, where all the buildings seem to be 19th century origin, and really just a really interesting architectural standard down there. I first learned of Christine from a really interesting article she wrote for BYU Studies in 2002. It was a special issue on the restored gospel and good government. And Christine wrote an article to moderate and unify taking her cue from Elder Oak's talk, in which he spoke about the need for Latter-day Saints to moderate and to unify. And her book, her article really shows some rare insight and counsel as to how Latter-day Saints can play a role in healing American political discourse. And so she follows along nicely with Bob's introduction tonight about being peacemakers. She is going to, I encourage you to the BYU Studies is online, readily available, and look at her article, how citizen rhetors, I didn't know what a citizen rhetor was until I read her article. And she's going to base her fireside talk largely on her article. She said she's going to cover the first 2 or 3 points rather quickly, but dwell longer on the problem of conveying truth in political rhetoric. And she says to her, the central problem in our politics right now is the flood of lies, misinformation, and disinformation, much of it because of our fragmented media landscape and the 24/7 use of social media that prevents us and our legislators from talking about, debating, and deliberating on widely agreed upon facts, or at least probabilistic or provisional truths that provide a basis for political action. Then she makes this comment, which I think she'll tell us more about next week. The divisions in our society are perhaps even more about our disagreement on what the facts are than they are about our suspicions about and dislike for one another. So I think that's going to be a marvelous fireside, and I invite you all to stay tuned next Saturday at 7 o'clock to listen to Christine Hansen. Thank you all for attending tonight. We had a great attendance, and we really appreciate, again, Bob for his wisdom and insight and his willingness to share with us tonight. I'd like to ask my good friend Melanie Tappan if she would give us a benediction tonight. Melanie, are you able to unmute and share a benediction with us?
I'm right here. Just a minute. Our Father, which art in heaven, we thank thee for this night. We thank thee for hearing these words that brings memories back to our minds of the day we were converted, the day that we turned our hearts over to thee and to thy Son. That wonderful day when the blackness cleared and we could see our souls and how valuable they were, and we could see how valuable we are to thee and what that meant to us. We thank thee for that opportunity to remember those times and those days when the light was shown to us and we accepted it with great gladness and humiliation and love. We thank thee for the Book of Mormon. We thank thee for the words in it. We thank thee for this wonderful series of firesides that help us to remember who we are, what we stand for, and what we are made of, what we hope to accomplish, and what we hope our children and our families will accomplish. We ask thy blessings to be upon all of us who were listening to this tonight, to remember this night always and what it meant to us. We thank Ross Boundy for his persistence and his energy to keep bringing these to us, over 100 of them that change our days these past 2 years. We're grateful for the gospel and the blessings that it gives to us. We thank thee. We thank thee with all of our hearts for the gospel, for thee, for thy Son. And we say, and the priesthood restored to the earth. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks again, Bob. I always extend an invitation to everybody who speaks to us to come and visit us on Bainbridge Island. And you've got a double reason to do so, because as I told you, a little secret, we little play on our name Boundy. We call our farm Bountiful Farm. And so we have something in common there as well. I love for that phrase.
Ross, let me just say, I see one of the persons who is watching this is Robert Talbert, the man that I spoke to, that I had the privilege, 67 years ago of teaching the gospel to him and his dear wife, Bobby, people I love so much, whose children and grandchildren, and they themselves have served a number of missions, and their children and grandchildren have serve missions. So what a delight to see people that I taught the gospel to before I knew anything about it.
A reminder to all of you, if you'd like to be receive regularly and receive the announcements, all you have to do is write to me, and I'm happy to add you to our regular announcement list that goes out every week. So again, thank you so much, Bob Rees, and your wife for her assistance as well. I want to wish all of you a good Sabbath, and we'll tune off for tonight. Thank you.
Thanks again, Ross, and everybody.
Thank you so much, Brother Rees. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a